Hey everybody, it's Angel. You're watching ASMR Angel Reads. I forgot to mention at the last recap of Chapter 5 that the evil elf Lottolane was Addern's son, so he was half elf and half human. And they ended up killing him at the end of Chapter 5. And Addern was really sad. So anyway, what we left off chapter 6 last time was Rodri was giving Cullen the command of his army, and Jill is going to be in Lovian's retinue. They're going to stay there for the winter at least. I need my glasses. So Jill went down to dinner in a dress. She hated every minute of it, but here they are at dinner. The meal was nearly finished. When a page hurried to the table to announce Lord Sivan, the first of Corbin's allies, to come and sue for peace. As befitted the ritual of the thing, he came alone and completely unarmed, with not so much as a table dagger in his belt, and he knelt before Lovian like a common rider. The entire hall fell silent as Lovian coolly considered him. The noble-born leaned forward, Edar with a tight twist of contempt to his mouth, the rest expressionless. "I've come to beg you for forgiveness and your pardon," Sinvan said, his voice choking on shame, "for raising my sword in rebellion against you. This is a grave thing you ask of me. What restitution do you offer?" 20 horses, coin for my share of the loot for Dulmir and all his men dead, and my little son to live in your dune as a hostage. Although Jill was thinking that this sounded small fee for such trouble, Lovian nodded. "If the Gorbert approves those terms, I shall take them. No doubt you're hungry after your long ride. You may sit with my men, and a servant will feed you." Sinvin winced, but as a sign of submission he did it, taking a place at the end of one of the riders' tables. They all ignored him, looking through him as if he were made of glass. As the general chatter picked up again, Jill turned to whisper to Danyan, "Why did Our Lady let him off so lightly? He's a poor lord as it is. He'll have to borrow from every cousin he has just to pay the lewd, and if your lady made his clan destitute, they'd rise in rebellion some fine day." Besides, Medula put in, "by being so generous, she shamed him good and proper. That'll sting worse than the coin." The two nodded sagely at each other. Jill realized that they were going to be her guides and teachers in this new world, where intrigue was dangerous and intrigue was as dangerous as 1,000 swords. As soon as possible, Jill left the table and went to look in on her father. As she made her way down the corridor, she heard laughter coming from his chamber, and when she opened the door, she saw Rodri sharing a meal with Cullen. The sight of them together made her freeze, her hand on the open door, as they both turned to look at her. The lantern light seemed to swell in the glow of a fire, picking out the glitter of the silver dagger in Cullen's hand. "Well, by the gods," Cullen said, "this fine lady can't be my scruffy little silver dagger's brat." Don't tease. I'm miserable enough as it is." She allowed herself one glance at Rodri. "I'll leave you to your talk with your captain, my lord." "My thanks," Rodri said. Jill stepped out and shut the door behind her. Only then did she realize that she was terrified just from seeing Cullen and Rodri together, as if in some mad way she thought they were plotting about her behind her back. 7 days passed without a word from Gerbert Rise, who would have to oversee the judgments Lovians made upon her rebel lords. Rodri was furious, seeing the delay as a slap at him, a perception no one bothered to deny. Jill's presence in the dun was another constant torment. He simply couldn't keep his mind off her, and seeing her was worse, making him remember their night together, the first time he'd ever had a woman who could match him in bed. He took to spending as much time as possible alone, going for long rides or merely walking out in the ward. During one of these aimless rambles, he ran across Cullen down by the back of the wall of the dun. Although his left arm was still in a sling, Cullen was working out with one of the light wooden swords used to train young boys. Moving so slowly that it was kind of a dance, Cullen was lunging and falling back while he described a figure 8 with the point of the blade in a perfect concentration that was more like a dwemer than swordplay. Even sore and weak, Cullen was a marvel when he moved with the weapon in his hand. Finally, he noticed that Rodri was watching him, and he stopped to make him a bow. "How does your arm fare?" Rodri asked. "Not too badly, my lord. Maybe tomorrow we'll get the splints off for a look, the herbman tells me." Cullen glanced around, then pointed at the second wooden sword that was leaning against the wall. "Ever tried to spar this slowly?" "I haven't." Rodri took the sword. "Looks like a good game." To keep things fair, Rodri tucked his left arm behind his back. The sparring seemed like humorous parody of real combat at first, with both of them moving like men in a trance. It was a matter of moving in slowly, catching the other's blade in a parry, and then ever so slowly breaking free to glide in again from another direction. Yet it was difficult, too. Rodri had never been so aware of every subtle move he made when he was fighting, and of every move his opponent was making as well. Keeping his concentration so finely honed was a struggle. Finally, his mind wandered a little too far, and Cullen slipped slowly under his guard and flicked his shirt with the blunt point of the sword. "By the hells," Rodri said, "a touch sure enough." Cullen smiled and saluted him with the wooden sword, but all at once Rodri felt that he was in danger. That wooden or not, that blade could kill him in Cullen of Cremor's hand, and Cullen was thinking just that. "Somewhat wrong, my lord?" "Not. Here you've done enough for one day." "So I have. It grips my heart to admit it, but I'm tired." "Ah, well, I'll get my strength back soon enough." Again Rodri felt the shudder of danger as Cullen were giving him a warning. Had he noticed the way Rodri had been looking at Jill? If he'd been obvious, Cullen might well have. Rodri wanted to say something reassuring, some good plausible lie to put Cullen at ease, but he was just sensible enough to realize that he'd best not speak Jill's name where her father could hear. "It looks remarkably good," Nevin said. "I'm pleased." Cullen was glad that the Erbman was pleased, because to him his once broken arm looked bad, white flesh puckered and wrinkled, and far thinner than his other arm after long weeks in a splint. "The break mended fairly straight," the old man went on. "It should be good enough for a shield work if you're careful about building it up. Favor it for some time." "My thanks truly for all your work on me." "You're most welcome." Nevin paused consideringly. "Truly you are." Now that his wounds were fully healed, it was time for Cullen to formally take Rodri's service. That very night, before everyone in the dun assembled in the great hall, he knelt at Rodri's feet. Rodri leaned forward in his chair and took both of Cullen's hands in his. By the flaring torchlight, Cullen could see how solemn the young lord looked. It was a grave thing that they were doing. "And will you serve me truly all of your life?" Rodri asked. "I will. I'll fight for you and die with you if need be. Then may every bard in the kingdom mock and shame me if I ever treat you unjustly, or if I'm miserly to you." Rodri took a comb from the waiting page and made the ritual strokes through Cullen's hair to seal the bargain. As Cullen rose to the cheering of the warband, he felt strangely light and free, even though he'd just pledged his life away. The thought was puzzling, but he somehow knew that he had just repaid a debt. Now that he was officially the captain of Tyrion's warband, Cullen was back in the barracks, but he had a chamber of his own over the tack room, not over the horses, with the proper bed, a chest for his clothes, and the biggest luxury of all, a hearth of his own. When he moved in, Ammer carried up his saddlebags and bedroll and brought an armload of firewood. 2 prudent moves to curry favor with the man who had the power to discipline them with a whip if need be. Cullen hung his new shield blazoned with the red lion up on the wall and decided he'd unpacked. Well and good, lads. We'll be taking the horses out soon. I want to see how well you all sit on a horse, now that I'm not distracted by little things like Dwemer. The 2 riders allowed themselves small smiles. Captain Ammer said, "Are you and Lord Rodri going to start finding new men soon?" "Cursed right, we're badly under strength." They were truly, because out of the 50 men Rodri had at Duncanabane, only 17 were left, and out of the 50 from Dunguerburn, only 32. Yet Cullen knew that soon enough young men would show up at the gates to beg for a place in his warband. Not for them to worry that places were open because of so many bloody deaths. They would want the honor enough to ignore such an inconvenient fact. The honor, the chance at glory, and at root the freedom from the drudgery of their father's farm or craft shop. That very afternoon, when Cullen went down to the ward to exercise, 3 of the spearmen from Canabane asked him if they could join. "At least you know what war's like. I'll speak to Lord Rodri for you." And they were grateful, sincerely and deeply grateful, that such an important man as he would do them a favor. Rodri was gone from the great hall, and the pages had no idea where he was. Cullen searched the ward, and finally, as he passed by the storage shed, he heard Rodri's voice and a woman giggle. "Jill!" Cullen felt that he'd been turned into a tree and taken root on the spot. He'd just been a fool to take Rodri's offer. Jill was very beautiful, and Rodri already had sired 1 bastard, hadn't he? Since he couldn't quite hear what they were saying, he cautiously edged around the shed until he could just see them standing between a sack of firewood and the dun wall. They were a decent space apart, but they were smiling at each other with such absorption that they never looked up and saw him. Cullen's hand sought his sword hilt of its own will, but he forced it away. He'd sworn a solemn oath to Rodri, and later he'd have a talk with Jill. As he walked away, he saw Nevin coming toward him. "Looking for me?" Cullen said. "For Jill, actually. Her Grace wants her." "She's back there." Cullen jerked his thumb in the general direction, "talking with Rodri." Nevin's eyes narrowed as he studied Cullen's face. Cullen stared right back, the battle of wills that Nevin eventually won when Cullen could no longer bear to look at the man who knew full well the cause of his jealousy. "Tell my lord I need a word with him, will you?" He walked off, leaving Nevin to think what he would do. Amid piles of chainmail and racks of swords in the shed that did Dunguerburn for an armory, Cullen was just taking down a practice sword when Rodri caught up with him. "My lord, 3 of the Canabane spearmen want to ride for you. They claim to know somewhat about swordcraft." "Try them out. If you think they'll do, I'll take them on. You can make that a general principle. Truly, I trust your judgment of a man." "My thanks." For a long, painful moment, they merely looked at each other. Since Cullen had never been given to pondering his feelings and considering subtleties, he began to feel as if he were drowning. How could he both admire Rodri and hate him this way? It was because of Jill, but it was more than Jill. He simply couldn't understand. His enraged bafflement must have been obvious, because Rodri grew more and more uneasy. Yet he, too, couldn't seem to break away, and the silence grew so thick it was painful. "Cullen," Rodri said at last, "you know I honor you." "I do, my lord, and you have my thanks." "Well, then," Rodri turned idly away and seemed to be examining a nearby sword rack, "would I do somewhat that would cause you grief?" Somewhat, as palpable as if she'd walked in the door, Cullen felt Jill's presence between them. "Well," Rodri said, "do you hold me in such low esteem as all that?" "I don't, my lord. If I did, I wouldn't be riding for you." "Well and good then. Here, do you remember when I asked you to play Carnock with me? I do, and truly I never thought we'd live to do it. But we have. Tonight I'll bring the board over to your table and we'll have a game. After Rodri left, Colin stood in the shed for a long time, the wooden sword in his hands, and wished that he were better at thinking. On the long road he'd seen more courts from the underside than any man in the kingdom, and never had met a lord like Rodri. So much what every lord was supposed to be, but so few were. If only it weren't for Jill. If only. He swore aloud and went out to the practice ground to work his frustrations away. Cullen worked with a little too hard. By the time he realized that he had to stop, his head was swimming. By walking slowly and concentrating on every step, he reached his chamber without having to ask for help, and flopped onto the bed, boots, sword belt, and all. When he woke, Jill was standing beside his bed, and the slanting light through the window told him it was close to sunset. "What are you doing here?" Colin snapped. "You shouldn't be anywhere near the barracks." "Oh, I know, and I hate it, Da. I miss you. We hardly get a chance to talk these days." When Colin sat up, rubbing his face and yawning, Jill sat down next to him. In her new dress she looked so much like her mother that he wanted to weep. "Well, my sweet, I miss you too, but you're a fine lady now." "Oh, horse shit. Lovian can heap honors on me all she wants, but I'll always be a common born and a bastard." She spoke so bitterly that even Colin could catch this subtle point. "Rodri will never marry you, truly, and you'd best keep that in mind when you're giggling and flirting with him." Jill went pale and still clutched a handful of blanket. I've seen the pair of you looking at each other like hounds at a joint of meat. Stay away from him. He's an honorable man, but you wouldn't be the first beautiful woman that made a man desert his honor." Jill nodded, her mouth working in honest pain. Colin felt torn to pieces. He was sincerely sorry for her, that she'd never have a man she loved, and at the same time he wanted to slap her just because she loved another man. "Come along," Colin stood up. "You're not the barracks brat anymore, and you can't be hanging around here." Colin strode out, leaving Jill to follow, yet her words haunted him that evening, that she loved him and she missed him. He wondered how he would feel if she married some man the Tyrion picked out for her and she went off to live with her new husband. He would probably never see her but once or twice a year. He even had the thought of simply leaving Rodri's services and going back on the long road where he would neither know nor care where Jill was sleeping. But as he sat in the captain's place at the head table of the warband, he knew that he could never give up his newfound position. For the first time in his life, he had something to lose. Later, after the warband drifted back to the barracks and the noble lords up to the chamber, Rodri brought over a game of Carnock and the finest set Colin had ever seen. The playing pieces were flat, polished stones, white and black. The thin ebony board was inlaid with mother of pearl to mark the starting stations and the track, 16 interwoven triangles, so that even in firelight it was easy to follow. "I'll wager you beat me soundly," Rodri said. Colin did too for the first 3 games, sweeping Rodri's men off the board as fast as the young lord put them on. Swearing under his breath, Rodri began pondering every move he made and gave Colin a harder run for it. But still he lost the next 3. By then only one drowsy servant remained in the hall to refill their tankards. Rodri sent the man to bed, stopped drinking, and finally, after 4 more games, ran Colin to a draw. "I won't press my luck any more tonight," Rodri said. "It wasn't luck, you're learning." Colin felt the simple comfort of it as overwhelming. Here they were, 2 men who'd given themselves up for dead, safe at home by a fire, with plenty of ale and each other's company. While Rodri put the game back in its lacquered box, Colin got up and fetched more ale. They drank silently at first and slowly, making the moment last as the fire died down and shadows filled the hall. Colin suddenly realized that he was happy, a word that he had never much meaning for him before. Or he would be happy if it weren't for Jill, whom he loved too much, but loved truly enough to want her to be happy too. Maybe it was the ale, maybe it was the late hour, but he suddenly thought of a clear and simple way to solve the whole tangled mess. If he could do it, if he could bear to do it. All unconsciously, Roderick gave him the opening he needed, the chance to think about what he had seemed so unthinkable before. I wish Rice would get himself here. Oh, well, in a way, he's doing me somewhat of a favor. As soon as the rebellion started, my esteemed mother's going to put off all her boundless energies into marrying me off. It's about time you did, my lord. I know, the cursed run needs its cursed heirs. Ye gods, Captain, think how I must feel. How would you like to be put to stud like a prized horse? Cullen laughed out loud. Aches a man's heart, doesn't it? Rodri said, grinning. And for all I know, she'll have a face and a temper to match the lords of hell. It's her cursed kin that count, not what I might think of her. I see why the priest is always telling a man never to envy in the noble-born. And right they are, truly, men like me to marry to please our clans, not ourselves. The old proverb stuck an odd place in Cullen's mind, some long-buried memory that he couldn't quite get clear. He had a long swallow of ale and considered this peculiar idea. He could think of no way to broach it subtly. Tell me somewhat, my lord. Would you marry my Jill if you could? Rodri went so tense that Cullen realized that the lad was afraid of him as Jill was. It was gratifying. Common born or not, he was still Jill's father, still the man who'd decide that she would or wouldn't do. I would, Rodri said at last. I'll swear that to you on the honor of the male weeds. I've never wanted anything as much as I want to marry her, but I can't. I know that. They drank for a few minutes more, and Rodri never looked away from his face. You know, my lord, the mistress of the great lord has a cursed lot of power in this ran and court. Rodri jerked his head as if Cullen had slapped him. So she does, and no one would dare mock her either, provided she was never cast off to her shame. There's some women who would never have to fear such a thing. Good. Absently, Cullen laid his hand on his sword hilt. Good. They sat together drinking, never saying another word until the fire was so low they could barely see each other's faces. Perhaps the thing that Jill hated most about being in a lady's retinue was that she had to learn to sew. For all that Lovian was rich Tyran, most of the clothing worn in her dun was made there, and she owned every rider in her warband and every servant in her hall 2 pairs of shirts and briga or 2 dresses a year as part of their maintenance. Every woman in the dun, from the lowliest kitchen wench to Danyan and Medea, spent part of her time producing this mountain of clothes. Even Lovian took a hand and sewed Rodri's shirts for him, as well as embroidered the blazons on the shirts for her skilled servitors such as the bard. Since there was a defined honor among women about finesse of their sewing, Jill dutifully practiced, but she hated every clumsy stitch she made. That morning Nevin came to the women's hall, which was open to him because of his great age, and while she worked, entertained her with tales of Bardic, the mysterious country far across the sea. From the wealth of details, it was plain that he'd spent much time there, studying studying psychics. Truly, Nevin admitted when she asked him. They have much curious lore in Bardic, and most of it's worth knowing. It's a cursed strange place. So it sounds. I wish I could see it some day, but it's not likely now. Here, child, you sound very unhappy. I am, and I feel like the most ungrateful wretch in the world, too. Here her grace has been so generous to me, and I'm living in more luxury than I ever dreamed of, but I feel like a falcon in a cage. Well, in a way, you are trapped. It was such a relief to hear someone agree with her that Jill nearly wept. Irritably, she threw the sewing onto her wicker basket. Well, if you truly hate this kind of life, Nevin went on, perhaps you should leave it. What can I do? Ride the roads as a silver dagger? I should think not, but many a woman has a craft. If I spoke to the Tyran, she'd pay the prentice fee for you. Oh, and what sort of thing would I do? I hate to spin or sew or such like, and no armor or weapon master would take a woman as an apprentice, not even if the tyrant asked them. There are all sorts of crafts. All at once Jill remembered that he was Dwemer. He was so kind to her, so bent on winning her friendship, that at times she forgot the frightening truth. The gray gnome looked up from the floor where he'd been amusing himself by tangling her embroidery threads and gave her a gaping grin. "My lord," Jill said in a voice shaking, "you honor me too highly if you think I could take up your craft." "Maybe I do, maybe I don't, but it's a closed issue if you don't want it. I'm merely thinking about herb craft and plain and simple medicine, I know. I've learned a lot in my long year, and it would be a pity to let my knowledge die with me." Well, so it would. Suddenly Jill felt a real hope and daze. "And you travel everywhere and live the way you want?" "Just that, and you're bright enough to learn the lore. Lovian will understand truly if you want to leave. She'll know you'll be safe with me. But what about Da? I doubt me if he'd let me go with you, and truly we've been through so much together, him and me, that I hate to leave him too." "No doubt, but at some point you have to leave him." Although Nevin spoke quietly, his words cut like a knife. "Well, why?" Jill snapped. "If I stay here, and aren't you the one who was just telling me you're miserable?" "Oh, so I was. Just think about it. You don't have to decide straight away." Nevin left her to the tedious task of untangling the skeins that the gnome had ruined. As she worked, Jill thought over his offer. Oddly enough, she could see herself wandering the roads with a mule and dispensing herbs to farmers, and much more easily than marrying some minor lord and living in comfort. While it would hurt her to leave Cullen, she could always come back and see him whenever she felt like it. It would hurt much less than being shut up in the den with Rodri and his new wife, seeing him every day and knowing that another woman had what was beyond her reach. Or so Jill thought of him that morning, as beyond her reach. Toward evening she went out to the ward just for some fresh air, and Rodri followed her, catching her out by the wall among the storage sheds. "My lord should be more careful about chasing after me," Jill said. "What if someone saw you?" "I don't give a pig's fart if they did or not. I've got to talk with you. Let's find a place where we can be alone." "Oh, indeed? It's not the talk that's on your mind." "It is and it isn't. What of it?" Rodri smiled at her so softly that Jill followed him when he went around the shed to a private place in the curve of the wall. "This will do for now," Rodri said. The words seemed to stick in his throat. Well," he started, "you see, that sounds so cursed cold. You haven't said much yet that sounded like anything." "I know. Well, it's about a bargain we made, truly." "I thought as much. I meant that what I said, curse you. Things have changed somewhat." And he struck there again, looking at her with feeble, foolish smile. In sheer irritation, Jill started to walk away, but he grabbed her by the shoulders. When she swung around to break his hold, she tripped over the hem of her dress and nearly fell into his arms. He laughed and kissed her and held her tight when she tried to squirm away, and kissed her again so sweetly that she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him back, clinging to him, while she remembered all the pleasure and his kisses promised. "Leave your chamber door unbarred tonight," Rodri said. "You dolt, if someone catches you, the news will be all over the dun. Who's going to be up in the middle of the night but you and me?" He kissed her softly, letting his mouth linger on hers. "Just leave the door unbarred." When Jill shoved him away, he grinned at her. "I know you'll do it," Rodri said. "Till tonight, my lady." In a fury of lust and rage both, Jill hiked up her skirts and ran, turning around the shed and nearly running straight into Cullen. She yelped aloud in terror. He must have heard, must have seen. He set his hands on his hips and looked at her so mildly that she was sure she was in for the worst beating of her life. "Da, I'm sorry," Jill stammered. "And so you might be carrying on like a serving wench where anyone might see you." "I won't do it again, promise." "Good, you've got a chamber for that sort of thing, don't you?" Jill's head reeled as badly as if he slapped her. Cullen gave her the barest sort of smile and walked past, calling out to Rodri to wait for him. The two of them went off together, discussing some new men for the warband. So that's what Rodri wanted to tell me. Oh, by the goddess herself. She felt betrayed. Jill stood there for a long time and considered it. That where she might have been pleased, she felt betrayed. Cullen had handed her over to Rodri to be his mistress, just handed her over like a horse, and she wanted Rodri too much to protest. At that moment she saw clearly what her life would become, caught between the two of them, loving them both, yet kept away from both. Rodri would have his wife and Cullen the warband. She would be important to them in her way, rather like a valuable sword that they would never use in battle, only hung on the chamber wall to be taken down and admired once in a while. I can't do that, she told herself. I won't. Yet she knew that she could and that she would. The bars of her cage were made of love, and they would keep her in for all her gnawing at them. All evening Jill debated the question of whether Rodri would find her door open or barred. She decided that she should hold out and make him realize that he would have to court her, that she wasn't a bit of battle loot to be distributed by her father. When she went to bed that night she barred the door, but she couldn't sleep, and slowly, a bit at a time, her resolve wore away like sand under the storm tide. She cursed herself for a slut or worse, then got up and lifted the wooden bar free of the staples. She stood there for a moment, barred it again, then lifted it off and left it off. She stripped off her nightgown, laid down, and felt her heart pounding in the darkness. Not more than a few moments later he came to her, as sure-footed and silent as a thief. Just once, my love, he whispered. I'd like to have you in the light. I want to see what your face looks like when we've done. Jill giggled and threw the blankets back. He took off his clothes and slipped in next to her. At the touch of his naked body on hers, she forgot every worry she ever had about honor and betrayal, but she pretended to shove him away. He grabbed her wrists and kissed her until she struggled free. Then he caught her again. They wrestled with each other as much as they caressed each other, until at last she could wait no longer and let him win, pressing her down, catching her, filling her with his achy, fiery pleasure that made her sob in his arms. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.